Yeah, thank you so much for Ahmet, for organising this and for inviting me. It's sort of a massive. I'm really flattered and honoured to have been invited and to for people think my paper is merits any discussion at all. Yeah, I don't think I'll take up sort of this entire 30-minute section sort of presenting. I'm not going to try and present the paper or even do a summary of the paper, I suppose. Like, I'm happy to answer clarificatory questions about the paper, of course. I suppose what I will do is just sort of reaffirm some of my thinking behind the paper and behind the project, really, and what I kind of see it as and what I understand to be the kind of most interesting or important parts to me. So, yeah, obviously this paper is interested in sort of a relationship between Deleuze and the sciences, or between Deleuze's philosophical claims and all his references to bits and bobs of science and mathematics that are sort of littered throughout his works. And what I really want to try to do in the paper is to, I guess, contribute to a greater understanding of the question of that relation. Like, how do we go about approaching thinking about that relation in an appropriate way, and what kind of framework can we use to think about that relation? And I try to do that by sort of engaging really closely with contemporary philosophy of science. I think doing this allows us to sort of identify and kind of recognize a few errors that are there in the literature that's dedicated to this relation, the sort of few bits and bobs of literature that are out there. And at the same time, that engagement helps us to kind of correct these errors, or to kind of draw up what I argue at least seem to be more appropriate kind of parameters or criteria, or a more appropriate framework for approaching and thinking about this relationship between Deleuze's philosophical position and his references to scientific theories. Yeah, and I guess a kind of subsidiary aim of the paper as well is to kind of bring everything together and put everything in one place, because obviously Deleuze's sort of writings are really, each sort of work is really diffusely sort of structured. The body of work is really diffusely structured. The secondary literature, I think, is really diffusely structured. And I don't think there's ever really been, with respect to sort of Deleuze and the sciences anyway, any sort of great attempt to try and sort of bring that together and see how these different ideas and different sort of ideas about the ideas sort of hang together. And so drawing upon I lean upon sort of some work by Todd May here to try and kind of draw up a framework for sort of understanding some of the relations between a fair bit of that commentary. Yeah, so that's basically sort of my understanding and what excites me about the paper. As part of the kind of review process, I felt obliged to kind of not only set up the kind of framework for thinking about this relationship and pose the kind of question, but also try and, have a stab at answering that question and advancing a kind of positive claim about the relationship between Deleuze's philosophy and the sciences. If there's a part of the paper that I'm a bit maybe sort of less committed to, or maybe more, accepting of the fact that that's something that will develop in the future or probably get revised, then it's that part. Yeah, but that's just sort of like part of the, that process of writing the paper and putting all those ideas together. So yeah, I think those are sort of the main points and my main sort of thinking behind the paper. Obviously, there's lots more to do with the specifics and the nitty-gritty of the philosophy of science and more of the philosophy of physics and stuff that I talk about. Yeah, but I'm kind of just hoping that this serves as a sort of uh, intervention into sort of a part of the literature that I kind of think was sort of has been sort of spinning its wheels for a little while. And so I'm, even if any responses to this are kind of negative or like, George, what you're even talking about, it's a bit more like this. At least hopefully I'm kind of galvanizing something. So yeah, that's kind of the spirit behind the paper, really. And that's all I sort of had to say about the project at this point.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for this like overall intention and like background of the paper. So maybe we can just start with the questions. So
George, could I ask, George, could you just go back over something you mentioned? You said my brain went slightly off. When you were mentioning the part that you felt less committed to, could you just tell us which that is again?
Yeah, that'll be the sort of part towards the end of the paper when I sort of advance a positive claim, a positive sort of naturalistic interpretation of this relationship between Deleuze's references to the sciences and his actual philosophical claims. So this kind of minor naturalism idea. It's lovely to meet you, or quote unquote meet you, Charles, as well, by the way, because we had some little email exchange, and that was really helpful for me when I was sort of thinking about these ideas. So, hi.
So could you continue about that? Because I mean, that I found that part that you're less committed to pretty interesting. So it pains me to think, wow, uh, you sort of go, yeah, well, that could go away. So why do you feel less committed to it?
I think I don't know, maybe less committed is the wrong sort of turn of phrase. Obviously the paper is sort of quite a long paper, and I was kind of satisfied with it being a project that's kind of assessing and critiquing the kind of current state of affairs and trying to sort of set up uh, a new kind of approach or just way of framing this discussion about Deleuze and the sciences. So I guess when I say I'm kind of less committed to it, it's probably just the bit that had the less sort of less time and kind of intensive research that went into it. Maybe I do think like I do stand by those arguments at this point. I think I quite like my on in part, which part is the part I'm talking about? Like my critique of the non-naturalistic interpretation, like I stand by that, and I think that's that makes sense to me. And I think the suggestion of a kind of minor naturalism follows quite nicely from that. Yeah, I think maybe I'm just, being hesitant or reticent and being sort of overprotective of myself or something. But I'm glad you found it, interesting or exciting.
Well, I really like those last two paragraphs of that section, the section 6, just before the conclusion, because it wrapped things up. Maybe it wrapped things up too neatly, but it wrapped things up nicely for me. So I was very appreciative.
Oh, great. That's good to hear.
I like the rest of it too, not just those two paragraphs, but I made it there. So I figured, I made it almost to the conclusion. So there I am. So then I stumbled to the conclusion and then I was done.
Brilliant.
One more thing, I may be living in a borough somewhere here in Michigan, but apparently I missed out on what you call, or what has been called, what Gaffney labels the scienticity polemic in Deleuze studies. Can you sum that up in a nutshell? Because I'm just curious. Didn't know we had polemics.
Yeah. So I can't. What work is that in of Gaffney's? It's got like the term virtual in the title or something. You'll have to forgive me because this paper I'm kind of revisiting it over the past few days after it, writing it sort of more than a year ago. So
The force, it's Gaffney, The Force of the Virtual, Deleuze, Science and Philosophy from 2010. That's the reference.
yeah. For the life of me now, I can't quite remember the details of that polemic. Mike, I don't know if you have a more sort of recent sense of this.
I actually haven't read this piece, but it's going on my reading list because it sounds
Yeah.
fascinating.
Okay,
I
well,
think
I'll be happy just to stay in my burrow, but, I mean, it just struck me as something that, I hadn't hadn't crossed my radar, but looks like something interesting, like Mike, I want to sort of check that out.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm stretching my memory a bit now, but I think if I recall correctly, it's kind of in a way another way of framing or setting up sort of certain commentators like Delander and Pratevi against, who sort of really value and thinks there's something like Deleuze's engagements with the sciences that sort of represent the core of his view against people who don't think that. That would be the kind of rough nutshell.
Yeah. If you have any questions, you can just unmute yourself or write your questions to chat.
Can I ask one?
Yeah, please go.
Have you gotten any negative feedback from the article? I find it hard to believe that you would. I can't really see anything to anyone would object to unless it's coming from the analytic philosophers you're talking about who have problems with Deleuze. But has anyone given you any negative feedback?
Oh, no, not at all. No. The review process was a bit sort of, comprehensive, let's say. But no, since the piece came out, I guess maybe I don't know. I was a bit on edge when the piece came out because I felt maybe like I was being a bit polemical. I felt like I was just being critical to everyone. But in fact, sort of John Pratevi reached out. I hope he doesn't mind me saying this, but he reached out via email sort of shortly after the piece was published and said he liked it, and sort of we had a nice little discussion off the back of it. So actually the sort of reception has been quite positive, which I'm sort of happy to say.
Good. Good.
I have a question. Thank you, George. This is an excellent paper.
Oh, thank you.
One of the things I really liked is when I read it, and you both argue that Deleuze is an ontological naturalist and a methodological naturalist. I immediately was like, wait, that can't be the case. And so I was sort of fascinated at your argument. But one sort of lingering question or like objection I have to Deleuze as an ontological naturalist is so you defend his ontological naturalism against Patton's claim that he allows certain spooky entities to exist, and what you on page 7 kind of summarize what the spookiness comes down to is objective modalities. You have a spookiness, as we have seen, describes entities or properties that are not recognized by the sciences, and so are immediately and invariably objectionable to the naturalist. And then you show that objective modality is not actually objectionable to the scientist, and that Deleuze's affirmation of the virtual is perfectly compatible with ontological naturalism. What I was wondering, though, is when I thought of spooky entities in Deleuze, I didn't think of the virtual. I was thinking of when he talks about the contemplative soul, beginning of chapter 2 of Difference of Repetition. There is this contractile power or contemplative soul that is the basis for there to be a sort of prolongation of one moment into another, such that you can have the formation of habit. And these contemplative souls which he will, in that chapter, he kind of oscillates between calling them contemplative souls and calling them like the imagination in Hume. This sort of force or power that allows there to be a prolongation of the past into the present. I find it a hard time reconciling that with what I would think of as a sort of scientific naturalism. And that also, I think his best formulation of that actually comes in What is Philosophy? Pages, I think it's pages 210 to 213. He kind of comes back to this idea. And at one point at the bottom of 212 of What is Philosophy, he says, chemical affinities and physical causalities themselves refer to primary forces capable of preserving their long chains by contracting their elements and by making them resonate. No causality is intelligible without the subjective instance. So he even refers to these souls or forces of power to contract as like sort of subjects, like in the Leibnizian monadic sense, is that there has to be the subject that is contracting and bringing things together for there to even be like objectivity. And so I consider that to be sort of profoundly anti-natural sort of moment in Deleuze. And really, maybe that may be the only one, because I do agree with your argument against Paul Patton. So I'm just wondering if you had thought about that, or what you thought about his use of these sort of almost like Leibnizian monads as sort of ontologically basic and preceding the very appearance of like physical causality.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I think, yeah, if there are places where kind of one wants to contest this naturalistic interpretation and defend a kind of non-naturalistic interpretation, if not along the same lines as people like Paul Patton, then yeah, that like places like that seem to be sort of the sort of textual resource to go to. Yeah, so I've just got to sort of say that like that's an instance that I haven't sort of given too much thought to yet. I've always found the second chapter of Difference and Repetition a bit scary. That Three Syntheses of Time as well, that's there, right? And and I recognize that, yeah, on the face of it, the stuff on the contemplative soul, habit, I think anywhere where the kind of this kind of quasi-transcendental or maybe even phenomenological sort of side of Deleuze is sort of most accentuated, is the kind of aspects that are most difficult to reconcile with any sort of like naturalistic interpretation or view one might to defend. So in that sense, I completely agree with you and sort of agree that that's kind of a pretty big question mark if I have to try and reconcile with the project of the paper. I mean, one kind of bit sort of hand-wavy response is to kind of attribute maybe all that talk in which Deleuze is seemingly straightforwardly non-naturalistic to this kind of, oh, well, you know, there he's operating in that kind of on that register where science is major science or something like that, right? Because I kind of demarcate this kind of sense in which he has this kind of like dual attitude towards the sciences that's kind of demarcated by his distinction between major and minor science. So one sort of strategy would be to attribute all this kind of seemingly incompatible talk to that kind of register, maybe. But to be honest, I just haven't given too much thought to those parts of his corpus yet. And and that's just, I don't know where my sort of instincts lie with respect to that. I don't know if you have any ideas or if you have a sense of how that material hangs together with some of the material that I'm discussing in the paper.
Yeah, I think the example I brought up, it's really hard to reconcile it with science because I think his influences, why he's positing this contemplative soul, he's coming from this tradition of Leibniz and the French thinker Raymond Rouillère. And Rouillère especially, when he develops his concept of absolute forms that precede material, like material basic building blocks, he's, I'd say, profoundly anti-naturalistic. I think it's pretty straightforward to read Rouillère as anti-naturalistic and positing these absolute forms as preceding anything like basic matter and actually being a condition of possibility and like a necessary condition for there to even be these as he calls, molar aggregates. So, I mean, if Deleuze is just sort of lifting this idea from Leibniz and Rouillère, then this is definitely a case of him having an anti-naturalistic ontology. But you know, as Deleuze, whenever he lifts something, he always changes it and brings it in. So I think there could be a way of reading it, or at least downplaying the history of where he's getting it from and reading it within a larger sort of system ontology. So yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I think I mean, that seems sort of really great. And I feel like you've just kind of given me one of my next subsequent paper projects or something in a way. So thanks for that, James. Yeah, I don't know if there's no other response from me at the moment, then that sounds really interesting and something that I definitely need to investigate.
I hadn't thought about this. Maybe I can share it at this point. So I don't think that like Deleuze's ideas on contemplative souls and the first synthesis of time necessarily leads him into an anti-naturalism, because in my understanding, contemplative souls are also like, as he calls, contractions of habit, and their only function is to like create, like it just to lay the foundation for memory. So in that passages in like chapter 2 of difference and repetition, Deleuze talks about, for instance, maybe I am misremembering, like just correct me if I am wrong, but he's also talking about like cellular and material forms of memory, and he connects like the contemplative souls to this forms of memory as well. So he kind of connects the first sense of time to second sense of time. But apparently, yeah, you are right. Like he takes also the contemplative soul, the term is coming from Neoplatonic philosophy as well. But I tend to understand contemplative souls in terms of just material contractions of which retain like material contractions which enable things or living beings to retain information in some form. Like this was my reading, rather than like just otherwise it would just lead Deleuze to I don't know an ontology which is filled with I don't know, not supernatural, but
Contemplative souls.
yeah, full of contemplative souls, Neoplatonic entities. So yeah, I tend to read in more naturalistic, in the broader sense way when it comes to first and second sense of time.
I mean, I'd say one thing to add to it is the way he understands contemplative souls. It's not that we have things like dirt and rocks and they are contracted into a plant. It's that even the rocks themselves are contractions of, smaller things. And so you ontologically have to have this soul or contemplative self prior to there being anything like matter. It's a necessary condition for there to be anything like matter, because otherwise you would just have these pure instants which wouldn't be contracted or connected to each other in any way, and you'd have like pure chaos. And so I think it's that these contemplative souls have to be like ontologically prior to matter for Deleuze, if you sort of read him this way.
I guess a point that's worth thinking about there is to what extent would this kind of this idea of I keep jumbling this word in my mouth, a contemplative soul, to what extent is that notion something that is recognizably sort of straightforwardly subjective in the way that you were emphasizing earlier, James, right? Given other parts of Deleuze's thought, like his, I mean, we all know he sort of likes to, he appropriates and he gets a lot of stuff from Kant, but something he's really resistant to is this idea of a kind of, transcendental subject, and he's sort of critical about phenomenology in the same way. And, so one would wonder whether in his appropriation of those kinds of conceptual resources from people like Leibniz and Ria, is he kind of, even though he's retaining that terminology and vocabulary soul, is he sort of retaining it in a way that he wants to sort of be, to indicate a kind of sort of subjectivity in the way that sort of you were suggesting earlier, or is he kind of, yeah, sorry, go on.
It makes a strange form of subjectivity, because he does explicitly call it a kind of subject. He calls it the brain becomes subject when it becomes this contractile surface that contracts intensities or contracts sensations and whatnot. So, I mean, he does explicitly in What is Philosophy in the conclusion call it a kind of subject, of course, but it's, it's going to be a very different kind of subject from like a Kantian transcendental subject. But the other reason I kind of bring it up is my argument, the way I read Deleuze, is that the contemplative soul in Difference and Repetition becomes the body without organs in Anti-Oedipus. And so I think, if you say, well, Deleuze doesn't have a notion of the subject, but he does have a notion of something like this sort of substratum that must precede the existence of material entities, such as you can't have desiring machines without there being a body without organs that is somehow contracting these instants. So yeah, I think it's an interesting question, and yeah, I'll let someone else ask a question.
Great. Can I jump in then? Cool. So, sorry, I had a thing that I was considering throwing into that conversation, but yeah, I did want to make one hermeneutical point about reading difference and repetition. And I buy this interpretation. I've heard a few people float where you should read chapters 1 and 2 as sort of Deleuze appropriating stuff from the history of philosophy, taking that in. Chapter 3 is the turn, and chapter 4 and 5 is him like re-explicating in his own voice. And if so, that means we should at least be somewhat suspicious of claims made in chapters 1 and 2, more so than later chapters, as maybe these are pulling in more of the baggage from the sources they're coming from, rather than being fully things Deleuze is committed to. But setting that aside, I want to ask the sort of inverse version of James's question, because I agree with you that Deleuze is an ontological naturalist, but I'm not sure about methodological naturalist, and for two reasons. One is straightforward, looking at what is philosophy with Guattari, where you just have different things that science and philosophy are doing, so that even if one person is sort of doing both, you can ideally separate the different activities. And if even in the moment of someone sort of working at that intersection of philosophy and science, you can make an ideal separation of this is what the philosophy is, the creation of concepts, etc., and this is the science, it seems like we're talking about different methods. And two, to point to Deleuze's own engagement with science, and here I'm just taking Mary Beth Mader's point, that Deleuze never seems to be straightforwardly just letting the science make the point for him. I think he's accepting the ontology of the sciences in a lot of ways, and you point out how careful Deleuze is about getting the science right when he's working with it. But it's never enough to do something like say Quine would say, of, well, our best account of the world says these things, our best account comes from the sciences, therefore we're allowed to just therefore we're just allowed to wait, I'm crossing my point, sorry. it's not that these are the ways of, like Quine would say, these are the best ways of investigating the world that we see in the sciences, and so therefore philosophy would have to use the same methods because those are our best ways of investigating the world, as we see from the success of the sciences. Deleuze sort of takes the ontology that would come from those and then tries to graft those onto his wider metaphysics. So usually when he's pulling things from the science, he's also going to do the work to say, and if you take difference to identity, you can make sense, or here's how this makes of the claim that difference is prior to identity, and that is straightforwardly not a scientific or a scientific methodology. And maybe the idea of a minor naturalism gives a different, because I'm taking a general account of naturalist methodology from the analytic literature, and so maybe your idea of a minor naturalism has a different naturalist methodology, and so maybe I'm wrong about, I'm assuming you mean by naturalist methodology.
Yeah, yeah, I don't know. I mean, so you were breaking up there a bit, Mike, so I didn't sort of like catch every single thing, but like I'm interested in this idea of does the sheer fact that philosophical inquiry and scientific inquiry look like different activities, and and not does the fact that they don't look like literally the same activity count against a possible sort of methodological naturalism in your view?
Well, yeah, the distinction that I think I'd make here is that in sciences you have all of these, you have all of these structures of reference, right? You've got things that you are trying to coordinate. You're doing all the work of experimentation. You're generating functions and equations that coordinate these different things. And so the method is very much one of establishing reference and making coordinations between references. Whereas in philosophy, you are creating concepts and sort of making sense of these connections, and doing so in a way that by its nature obscures direct reference somehow. And in that sense, that's what I mean by it seems like that Deleuze has an account that these have different methods because they proceed by different activities. And at some point, they're even in a sort of tension. Not that they oppose each other, but that tension is something that further work needs to be done to reconcile. Because when philosophy makes concepts, those concepts are necessarily vague. And when science is making functions, reference needs to be as ensured as possible to make those coordinations possible. And so there's a tension between the inherent vagueness of philosophy and the need for unambiguous reference in science.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not sure. So I'm aware that you're coming very much from a kind of like your point is very much rooted in what is philosophy. And I guess my kind of immediate reaction to that would be the same sort of point I make in the paper of, oh, well, how do we sort of reconcile that view with something like the major minor science distinction, where when it comes to minor science, Deleuze doesn't seem to hold precisely that view. Yes. Yeah, I mean, it's not sort of super obvious to me that just because philosophical inquiry involves this activity of creating concepts and trying to make sense of, I don't know, this broader sort of differential picture or something like that, and scientific inquiry maybe isn't necessarily quite doing that. I think more needs to be said there, to my mind at least, to kind of to generate that inference to not methodological naturalism. Yeah, I don't understand methodological naturalism as literally as meaning sort of philosophy literally uses the same methods as the sciences. I mean, I sort of understand it a bit more broadly as something like, uh, you know, philosophy takes sort of scientific information, or philosophy is sort of like broadly scientifically informed or something like that. Of course, in the paper, I'm exploring sort of the question of methodological naturalism just strictly with respect to the relationship between, strictly like in the context of Deleuze's references to the sciences, right? So there's obviously a broader question of like, is Deleuze a methodological naturalist? That isn't sort of covered, or I don't even try to address in this paper, which I think maybe is potentially something you're getting at there, and which, yeah, honestly, I don't, is sort of a bit of a, I'm still sort of clearing that area of the mini map, so to speak. Yeah, that's not, I don't know if that's a very sort of satisfying response at all. Like, that's really sort of interesting and makes things sort of a bit clearer to me. But I don't think I can respond in a sort of way that makes things satisfyingly clear to you.
No, no, that's great. So,
Yeah, I mean, you've already sort of like said this a little bit, but sort of do you take it to be the case that sort of even in the cases where Deleuze is quite obviously sort of careful and sort of heavily sort of engaging with science and mathematics, that there's still something to kind of distance him from a kind of methodological naturalism?
I think that's what I'm unsure of. And that's why I was curious about your view of methodological naturalism, and if your idea of a minor naturalism gave a different account of what methodological naturalism would be. Because I think the critique that Mater makes against, say, someone like Delanda, I think that critique lands. That critique
Right.
broadly being that uh, when Deleuze is explicating Deleuze, at least, he's making it sound like, well, there's the sciences. And so in order to bring into his philosophy, Deleuze has to make a concept that just translates the thing from the science into the philosophy. And I don't think Deleuze is doing that at all. I think he's seeing science as clarifying certain points, and also, having a general commitment to an ontological naturalism. And so he's doing the process of re-expressing through arguments or giving the metaphysics that would ground the scientific insights. And that's a different process than just saying something like, well, the sciences have discovered information channels, and so I call an information channel the dark precursor, which is,
Yeah.
a bit of a caricature of Delanda, but I think is a fair critique.
Mhm.
And so there, I want to say, if methodological naturalism is the thing that Delanda is doing when interpreting Deleuze, I think Deleuze isn't that. If methodological naturalism is something else, maybe understood through this minor naturalism, then I'm open to share what that account is. Although if I can throw an unfair question that might be where to look to investigate this. In the tradition, naturalism is almost always taken to be paired with representationalism. And so you have the expressivist critiques like Brandom and Price, who are rejecting naturalism. Price tries to like hack his subject naturalism, though I'm not sure how well that works. Whereas Brandom straightforwardly embraces naturalism. And the whole group seems to take it as, well, if you're a naturalist, you have to be a representationalist. And I agree that Deleuze is a naturalist, and he's clearly not a representationalist. So I'm wondering if that rejection of representation and whatever have to put in its Deleuze's account of expression, maybe, to make sense of his naturalism, that would provide a different account of what a naturalist is. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that, or if that's just an unspeculative question.
Yeah, I mean, so again, I think you broke up a bit. What was the specific? You mentioned that you were referring to something specifically. What was that thing?
Oh, the analytic non-naturalists, Random and Price,
Okay.
who like take naturalism and representationalism to pair that you can't separate two. Whereas if Deleuze is consistent, it's clearly an example of a naturalist who is not a representationalist, and does that make possible a new idea of what a naturalist methodology?
Cool. I mean, the quick response to that is, I don't know, because I'm not too up on my Brandon and Price, right?
Understandable.
Yeah, I mean, what you were saying earlier sort of made me think like, so I don't know, take sort of a bit of contemporary philosophy of science or philosophy of physics, people who consider themselves to be hardcore ontological and methodological naturalists, right? People like ontic structural realists who spend their time thinking about and trying to articulate this idea that the world is just kind of some sort of primitive, objective, modal, purely relational structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
No science takes that as its subject matter, right? And no science sort of says or presents that idea. They're doing that kind of, if you like, creating that relevant or attempting to articulate and create those relevant concepts to kind of furnish an interpretation of how the science all hangs together, that kind of broader metaphysical picture. And when you were describing the kind of project that Deleuze is up to, it seems perfectly analogous to that kind of project, which I think is perfectly acceptably sort of understandable as a form of methodological naturalism. So maybe it's the case that I'm operating with a broader sense of what qualifies as methodological naturalism than you are, or that you're happy to do. And that's something we can sort of chit and chat about at some point. Because that's quite interesting, and maybe that maybe there are sort of really good reasons why you want this. If I'm right in thinking I'm operating with a, broader, narrower is the right way to kind of understand the relation between our ideas there. Maybe it's the case that you've got really good reasons for that, and I might want to reconsider my view. Maybe it's the case that you adopt that conception of what it is to be a methodological naturalist. Maybe it's the case that when you adopt that, you're kind of wrapped up in some of the similar thinking that I'm criticizing people like Patton and Protevi and Ansel Pearson for. I don't know. We'd have to chat more to figure that out.
We should.
So yeah, for sure. So yeah, I think I get the sort of concern, right? And I get why I'm sensitive to this idea that it's easier to get on board with the idea that Deleuze is an ontological naturalist than it is within being a methodological naturalist. I think I'm just always I feel like accounts, I feel like the arguments against him being a methodological naturalist need to say a bit more about what it is they take methodological naturalism to be. And I think a lot hangs on whether or not that's a good account of, or a reasonable account of, what methodological naturalism is. And that will depend in part upon, I would hope, the kind of sort of project that I've been trying to do and I'm trying to start in this paper of sort of figuring out, what should we understand by methodological naturalism? Oh, a good resource for us to sort of think about that would be engaging closely with people who've been thinking about this issue for quite a while, right? And contemporary philosophy of science and that sort of thing. So yeah, but I think that's just all really sort of like rich, interesting stuff that can be hashed out. And by all means, Mike, if you want to write a paper sort of with that idea and critiquing me and give me a citation and I'll reply to you and we can, do all that stuff.
We'll get the cottage industry going.
Yes,
Great.
that's the dream.
Thank you, George.
Edwin,
Thanks. Just a quick one, George, following up on the very point that you were just making. At one stage, you said in passing, I can't remember what you say in the paper, I'm afraid, but at one stage this afternoon, you said something like that you understood methodological naturalism in such a way that somebody is a methodological naturalist because they pay attention to what the natural sciences say, or they're attentive to what the natural sciences say, or something along those lines. And I wondered if you could put a bit more flesh on these bones, because as it stands, that does sound a bit too weak. Not least because it has the consequence that you count as a methodological naturalist just by virtue of doing the philosophy of science. And I take it that you want it to pack a bit more punch than that, or maybe not. I mean, maybe
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So I think that's completely right, and thank you, Adrian. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, clearly. Yeah, I mean, so I was just mentioning that in passing, and maybe I wasn't as sort of precise as I ought to have been. Yeah, it does seem as though I don't know, a properly fleshed out account of methodological naturalism seemed like one ought to involve some kind of normative claim with respect to one should be particularly deferential to the sciences or something like that, right? Or about scientific inquiry being a particularly good form of inquiry that we should pay particularly good attention to at the expense of other forms of inquiry or something like that. Yes, and yeah, I think that is right, and I think that seems to me compatible with, you know, I think that's the view I sort of take in the paper, and that seems to me, I don't know, yeah, I mean, we're getting sort of into the nitty-gritty of like how precisely do we understand methodological naturalism, what counts as methodological naturalism, and that's obviously a really, really nitty-gritty issue. And I think potentially part of the interesting and productive upshot of studying Deleuze in conjunction with these ideas is that I wonder whether Deleuze maybe affords us the resources to think about naturalism in a bit more of a broad way. So there seems to be this sort of view baked into his project, this kind of, I don't know how to put it, kind of like epistemological parity almost, right? He seems to be happy to draw on all kinds of sources and bits and bobs of information, whether or not it's from different bits of science, but also different bits of art, literature, cinema. And I don't know, I'm sort of in danger of sort of just pure speculative thought now, because this is stuff that I don't expect to be thinking about until sort of a few years from now. But I think maybe I'll try and force myself to, you know, I'll forcibly sort of prevent myself from speculating on that point. I think, yeah, there's a clear, yeah, you're right. There's a clear sense in which you know, if you're a methodological naturalism, you ought to think there's something special about the scientific inquiry and the information the sciences gives to us. I guess in the paper, again, that sort of, because I sort of focused so much on just the question of whether it seems as though Deleuze there might be a chance of Deleuze being a methodological naturalist, right? Because there's only a chance if it seems as though there's a particular sort of direction of explanation between the sciences and his philosophical claims, right? In the sort of sites of his references to the sciences. And I guess, yeah, because I've been just focusing so much on that question, I haven't quite managed to sort of give much kind of interrogation or thought to the broader question of, okay, well, does he think there's something special about the sciences, you know, that there isn't, you know, that make scientific inquiry sort of better or more special or more like helpful in developing a metaphysics than other modes of inquiry. I mean, he definitely thinks that scientific inquiry is different, right? And I don't know if maybe that's enough. But yeah, the question of a kind of like value, or if he wants to kind of introduce some kind of hierarchy there, I don't know. I mean, I can see why we would want to think he doesn't do that. Yeah, I feel like I'm just sort of like grinding speculatively now, but I don't know if that sort of like gets at or vaguely addresses what you were sort of asking about, Adrian.
No, that's good. Thanks, George. I mean, I mean, obviously these terms can all be defined in different ways, and I suppose I had thought that, if you'll pardon the pun, that the most natural definition of methodological naturalism would make it a stronger thesis than ontological naturalism. That, you know, your methodological naturalist is going to be an ontological naturalist, but not necessarily vice versa. And so that was part of the reason that I wanted to raise the question, because it then began to sound in the discussion as if, in fact, it was the other way around, or perhaps that there was not an entailment in either direction. But certainly, it was beginning to sound as if you were understanding methodological naturalism in a much weaker way. But it sounds from what you've just said as if you have at the back of your mind a kind of strengthening of it. I mean, it's not going to be enough just to be interested in the natural sciences, is it? I mean, it could be enough. One can define terms in whatever way one wants, but that's not going to be the most interesting position.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose a relevant consideration here that's just come to mind is, you know, obviously, if I'm in the position of wanting to flesh out a kind of like naturalistic interpretation of Deleuze's philosophical project, yeah, the intuition there is that, oh, well, I don't want to make that notion of methodological naturalism too strong, because Deleuze obviously engages with loads of different sorts of sources and information. And it's, you know, at least not obvious that he privileges some of those sources over others. Fine. But one relevant consideration there, I suppose, is, you know, we might plausibly he's engaging with, I mean, to put it sort of crudely, plausibly he's engaging with the sciences and mathematics to kind of retrieve metaphysical knowledge, right? Or to kind of build a metaphysics, if we're kind of accepting this sort of broadly naturalistic interpretation. There's a question as to whether his engagements with non-science are doing the same thing. Like, is he, because obviously Deleuze's project is sort of huge and multifaceted, and he's You see bits of ethics and aesthetics in there. And is it possible that, you know, we can understand his engagements with non-science as wanting to yield, as aiming at yielding non-metaphysical knowledge? And if that's the case, does that allow for a kind of slightly stronger form of naturalism? Does that sort of seem to sort of make sense or follow? And
Yeah,
that's,
I mean,
yeah. And
Yeah.
so is he wanting to do something else with all his engagements with the arts and semiotics and cinema and things like that? Is he sort of fleshing out a kind of, I don't know, analog to his metaphysics that isn't quite metaphysics or something like that, or something closer to a kind of phenomenology or something like that? I don't know. You know, that's another aspect of this sort of broader project that needs to be looked at and worked on. And I mean, that's just been a sheer case of, you know, I've only had so many months or years working on X, you know, I've limited amount of time and limited amount of words and stuff. But that's sort of coming, and that's something that I'd really like to look into. And that seems like a really relevant and quite central part of the project for sure.
thanks. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, thank you, George. I think you might have just answered my question.
Oh, cool.
Because I'm curious about the political thought. How does that fit into
Nice.
methodological naturalism? Because, like you said, there's no hierarchy. Deleuze is doing metaphysics all the time, even when he's talking about these other seemingly different domains. So it's not like, oh, the science comes and then you build the metaphysics and then the politics comes, you know, in the way that, like, you know, the Vianney quote maybe hints at that being possible, which it isn't. You're right. So I guess my question is can there be a methodological naturalism when he's doing his creating these political concepts? But all of his concepts, to help you out here, all of his concepts are meant to be flexible and to cross different domains too. Is it still methodological naturalism when he's thinking about things like the war machine? And if it's not, I mean, because math and science comes up when he talks about these things too, but it doesn't seem to be coming out of the math and science the way it does when he's doing some of the other metaphysical, you know, chapters of difference and repetition. It seems more so that things like Riemann and stuff like that come up because they kind of help make the points that he's trying to make. So because you just answered my first question, this was like my follow-up. But yeah, I'm curious what you think. You know, is he always a methodological naturalist, or does he sort of switch? That doesn't seem to be what you want to say. So I'm just curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think I can only have a kind of initial sort of speculative thought about that, because again, this is all, I mean, this entire discussion is really good because it's sort of speaking to what I see of, you know, the relevant branches that sort of eke out from this paper and sort of constitute the broader project. Yeah, I mean, I wonder if there's a way of sort of standing by this idea that he's naturalistic by suggesting something like, oh, well, isn't the fact that he's, and I'm, you know, again, I've only been focusing sort of most of my time in sort of largely in difference and repetition in certain parts of 1,000 Plateaus, and I haven't sort of dug really deeply into the kind of Deleuzean political thought. But isn't the fact that its political ideas are kind of cashed out in these, as you say, very sort of like flexible, or as Mike was alluding to earlier, sort of like purposefully vague, what's the term? Inexact but rigorous or something like that, like, you know, this kind of conceptual machinery. Isn't the fact that that's the case, plus the fact that we can tell some kind of plausible story of how he gets that entire sort of picture, that kind of conceptual machine, that package of conceptual machinery from his engagements with the sciences and mathematics in the way that I talk about in the paper. I wonder if there's an account there or a story there where we can kind of reconcile what you were, you know, that kind of the political thought with the kind of metaphysical and naturalistic thought. But I don't know if that suggestion to your mind illegitimately relies on or projects or introduces precisely the kind of, you know, kind of sort of epistemological hierarchy that we don't want to buy into, or that we don't think Deleuze, someone like Deleuze is willing to buy into, and that is compatible with Deleuze's project.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think there is a way to do it. I don't know how, but I think and my question was hopefully kind of to be food for thought more than like a gotcha question or something. But it was something when reading the paper, I did think of as like, okay, this is all making sense to me. But then when you think about other parts of his work, it's like, well, I'm having a hard time thinking about how this works.
Yeah.
You know, in particular spots, but. Yeah, no,
definitely. I mean,
very enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, great. Oh, thank you. I mean, yeah, so it makes perfect sense to me that you had those thoughts while reading the paper, because I have those thoughts while writing the paper. And, you know, I just had to kind of think, okay, one step at a time. But yeah, that's really sort of useful. And maybe I'd like to sort of approach you or sort of come to you for a bit more clarity on the political thought when I can sort of think about trying to make sense of how this sort of account that I've just sort of suggested off the top of my head might work.
James?
So just to kind of narrow this question about methodological naturalism, I'll just quote. So you have 3 definitions that you kind of use on page 13 of the paper we were given. You've first Ansel Pearson and Protevi, they have their weak version, their strong version, and then you have Paul Patton's definition. So I'll just read the weak version of Pearson and Protevi. Their weak version asserts a compatibility between the goals and methods of philosophy and natural science, so that they can and should inform each other, even though philosophy maintains its specificity and independence from science. So just have a more focused question. So are you committed, by saying that Deleuze is a methodological naturalist, to saying that science and philosophy have the same goals? Or the same goal?
I think philosophy as metaphysics and the sciences, yes, I reckon. Those goals will differ with respect to you know, degree of abstraction or something like that. But broadly, that's the way I understand their goals as being sort of similar, or yeah, broadly the same. If that's, I don't know if that's the answer you were expecting.
No, yeah, I just wanted to focus and on the what exactly methodological naturalism might really boil down to in like a single sentence.
Yeah, I mean, so yeah, you go on. Sorry,
to me, when I read Deleuze, I really read him steeped in Nietzsche to a certain extent, and sort of, you know, the not the essence of Nietzsche's philosophy, but what carries over from it into Deleuze is this critique of the will to truth, that philosophy isn't interested in truth. He actually at one point defines philosophy in the Nietzsche book. And of course, he's speaking of Nietzsche, so you can't say this is Deleuze's position also. But he says the goal of philosophy is to harm stupidity. And that's a very different project than the will to truth and the procurement and systemization of knowledge. So I was just thinking, you know, if you do see that science and philosophy have this similar goal and you call it metaphysics, I would just be wary of whether this is to assume philosophy also is following a will to truth, which may be the case for a lot of philosophers. But I think with Deleuze, it's very hard to attribute philosophy's goal to being some sort of knowledge or truth about the world. I would like my antithesis to your point. I would say philosophy for Deleuze is not a pursuit of knowledge or truth, but it's critique. And even his metaphysics, he only makes ontological claims in order to create an apparatus of critique of either the image of thought in difference and repetition, or critique of the state in Thousand Plateaus, etc., or a critique of opinion in What is Philosophy. And so I think his goals are always going to be first and foremost critique, and as you might say, harming stupidity, before it is making sort of universally valid claims about reality.
Okay. Right. So what? So is the question? I don't know what.
Just, you know, if you do assent that philosophy and science share the same goals, and that's sort of the root of your intuition about methodological naturalism, just sort of what is your reasoning behind that? What would be your response to, you know, me stressing a more Nietzschean critical direction, where philosophy is meant to be an aggression against sort of these state sort of practices of major science. And also, I think you're pointing to in the very end that there is an affinity between the minor sciences and philosophy in an important way. One thing I think you might want to add to that, which I was thinking about, is minor sciences and philosophy are similar, and they both begin from a problem. So he gives an example in the Nomadic War Machine chapter of Thousand Plateaus that one example of minor sciences is building a bridge. There's the problem of a body of water, and you need to build, you know, something to cross it. And so the very deployment of knowledge and whatever, you know, science does is always going to be a development and response to this sort of problem. And I think that's very, very close to how Deleuze understands philosophy as an apprenticeship, as a dealing with problems that are meant to invent solutions to these sort of unsolvable ontological problems.
Okay. Great. Yeah. I mean, thank you for that. Yeah. So I think, I mean, Nietzsche always gets a bit complicated. I think the point about, you know, the kind of will to truth and the critique of science through, or kind of like Nietzschean anti-naturalism from that angle, is just complicated by all the kind of relevant exegetical issues to do with Nietzsche's naturalist status or Nietzsche's engagements with the sciences and things like that, right? Because there's lots of different views floating around and lots of different ways we can sort of understand the project that he's up to, and how that will to truth stuff is reconcilable with some of his own more sort of seemingly naturalistic thought, or the ways in which he sort of leans on and appeals to kind of scientific or psychological thought. Yeah. And I guess part of me wonders, is it, I mean, yeah, it seems sort of implausible to suggest that the goals of the sciences, the goal of the sciences is something like critique in the way that you put it. But I do wonder whether it can be the case that there's a kind of compatibility there, or that, I don't know. So I don't like, I get why, I understand, I'm sort of sensitive to this resistance of, oh yeah, philosophy is just a project of sort of yielding true statements or something like that, right? I get the kind of resistance to that, and it's clear if you sort of spend any time with what is philosophy, that's not what Deleuze is interested in, or at least not what seems to be the sort of principal aim of philosophical inquiry. But I think maybe, I wonder whether the point I make in the paper about, with respect to that passage on the interesting, remarkable, singular, or I can't remember the precise sort of triad, also potentially speaks to this. I'm not sure.
Well, yeah, that would give
I mean,
philosophy a different goal than science. Yeah, so that would
I guess, yeah.
philosophy is interested in the singular and the interesting.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, I don't know if there's sort of a more complicated or nuanced way of understanding the goals of the sciences than just to sort of yield truth or true, or knowledge or something like that. I mean, clearly there is a sense in which scientific inquiry is sort of problem-based and responds to problems, right? And it's about wanting to yield successful predictions and explanations and things like that. And arguably, it's from the relevant mathematics that you get that kind of problematic or problem-based sort of structure or approach or framework or way of thinking that Deleuze's sort of project is, that furnishes Deleuze's project, or in which Deleuze's project is cashed out in the first place. So again, I think there's just this idea of, I mean, this speaks as well to like my thinking about this definition of this weak version of naturalism. It leans heavily on this notion of the specificity and independence of science, or the goals of science, or the goals of philosophy from science, right? And I'm kind of not sure what specificity and independence are supposed to mean there. And it seems as though a kind of specificity and a kind of independence of philosophical inquiry from scientific inquiry is perfectly compatible with quite a strong form of methodological naturalism. Again, you have sort of contemporary philosophers of science who take themselves to be naturalists in the strongest possible sense, who are very happy to accept that philosophical inquiry or metaphysical inquiry, the subject matter isn't precisely the same as any other science, and the activity clearly isn't precisely the same as any science, right? But it's still methodologically naturalistic. So there's always sort of a big push or a big emphasis on this idea of the specificity and independence of philosophical inquiry, and how that has some bearing on the question of methodological naturalism. And I mean, while I think it probably does, I don't know if it has the very sort of central place, or at least I think it's sort of I think it's perfectly compatible with a fairly plausible form of methodological naturalism, that philosophical inquiry or metaphysical inquiry can be really have its own sort of, enjoy its own specificity and sort of independence to a degree, in the sense of being an autonomous discipline. So I don't know, I feel like I'm sort of talking around your point a lot rather than sort of addressing it directly. I think maybe the idea that Deleuze's philosophical project is just critique, and that's kind of what everything in Deleuze's work is in service to, is maybe something I'm not quite on board with, or that maybe I would need to be further convinced by. I think there's definitely sort of, that's definitely a huge part of the project, and there are as Mike was saying earlier, you know, the early parts of difference and repetition, or there seem to be sort of parts of the work where that is the main purpose and there's a sustained effort at critique. But I do wonder whether something like a positive metaphysical project is being articulated and understood just for the sake of some kind of critical exercise or critical scrutiny of other people's work or something like that, or of an image of thought. Yeah, I
Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, this might piggyback off James' question, but first I want to say thanks. It's a really fantastic article and very stimulating. And I like Charlie actually did like your conclusion, riffing off of Todd May's distinction and answering it with major minor. That was persuasive to me for what it's worth.
Oh, great, thank you.
Yeah. So I kind of go in a slightly different direction because it seems you have two things you're looking at here. It's both Deleuze's relation to the sciences, but also Deleuze's relation to analytic philosophers of science, which are two slightly different groups of people. And I want to ask about the analytic philosophers of science, just sort of how you see that relation. Because it seems to me analytic philosophy took a turn toward language and it analyzes statements. And it's always seemed weird. To analyze science, it has to see science as a thing that produces statements, and then it can analyze the statements. It doesn't have a statement or a proposition. It doesn't quite know what to do. And I just want to read two things close to where James was. This is Ansel Pearson and Protevi, where their strong version, you say this on page 13, only natural science produces meaningful statements or credence-worthy beliefs. And then later on page 20, this is just you, or 21, summarizing analytic philosophy. Deleuze's axiomatic approach betrays a potential resemblance to the syntactic approach to theories in the analytic tradition, according to which such theories are conceived as collections of sentences whose relations to one another are understood by means of first-order quantificational logic. So it's that question that analytic philosophy sees science as a kind of machine for producing statements, and then it analyzes those statements. Science gives an account of things, or we have to listen to what science says. So it's kind of linguistic approach. And so it's a metaphysical question now about the metaphysics behind this analytic approach, because Deleuze has a chapter in Logic of Sense where he analyzes the proposition and says there are 3, maybe 4 dimensions of propositions. Here's a proposition. You can either refer to the world, which is the relation of reference or denotation or truth. It refers to the subject, which is the relation of belief. If I have belief, it's tied to a proposition. I believe that. And then you add the proposition. So theories are systems of belief, which means a system of propositions. Or you analyze the relation of propositions to each other, which is logic. And analytic philosophy, and then Deleuze says, actually, curiously, these 3 elements are tied to what Kant saw as the 3 sort of poles of traditional metaphysics. It's the world, which is truth and reference. It's the self, or the subject, which is belief. And then it's God, roughly, as the locus of abstract predication. That's what logic is. So implicitly in the proposition, there's this implicit metaphysics, a very traditional metaphysics with the 3 poles of self, world, God, truth, belief, and logic. And so that's sort of my question then. If Deleuze is getting a metaphysics for contemporary science, and there's this implication in when he analyzes the proposition that there's a kind of very traditional metaphysic implied there, where you look at the world, the subject, and logic, and simply focus on statements. And of course, this whole thing is to have done with judgment, which is to have done with statements. That's not really what philosophy is about. And it seems like analytic philosophy needs statements from science in order to go about its business. It has to see science as producing statements, or it has nothing to work with. Not quite. I mean, this is a bit of a caricature, but Deleuze is trying to do his own metaphysics. Analytic philosophy just, again, a caricature, seems to be embedded in a certain kind of metaphysic. And I just wonder what you think about that. Does that mean they're hard to bring together in some way, that Deleuze's metaphysic is very different from this sentence proposition based analysis, where theories are collections of sentences, belief are sentences, and so forth? So I just wondered since these are both metaphysical systems, what you think about either their divergence, incompossibility, or how you bring them together, which is, I think, part of the aim of your paper.
Yeah, so I mean, thank you for that. I'm really glad you asked that question. And I appreciate this probably speaks to, I mean, yeah, you've got a paper on axiomatics and problematics, or if that's the title, or you know, that's the sort of theme of it, which I've found really interesting and which speaks to these ideas quite well. Yeah, I kind of buy everything you say. The sort of story you tell there about the potential analogy with certain ways of understanding science and a certain kind of metaphysics, and whether or not that's the kind of sort of metaphysics that is there seems to be a tension between that kind of metaphysics and the kind of metaphysics that Deleuze is interested in articulating. Yes, I would add to that though that I think so the history of kind of analytic and philosophy, the recent history of analytic philosophy and the philosophy of science is really interesting to me. And it seems more and more that nowadays, sort of contemporary philosophers of science understand the philosophy of science as something that is not identical to or part of, or is becoming increasingly independent of the quote unquote analytic tradition in philosophy. You've got traditional sort of analytic metaphysics and the inclinations towards you know, longer ago, I guess, the inclinations towards sort of being more language focused and statement focused, that a lot of philosophers of science are kind of dissatisfied with and want to distance themselves from. Hence the emergence of and the popularity of something called the semantic approach to the representation of scientific theories rather than the syntactic approach. So now, broadly speaking, I think most philosophers don't agree that with the view that we ought to understand scientific theories as collections of sentences and of scientific inquiry as yielding sentences or axioms or something like that, or in that kind of syntax that in the way that's cashed out by that syntactic view that's analogous to the kind of axiomatic major scientific view. I think the approach now is something much more sort of like mathematics forward. It's understanding sort of scientific theories in terms of models and collections of models. And a question that this thinking about and writing this paper generated for me was, oh, okay, there seems to be this analogy between the major scientific understanding of science, ways of, if you like, the representation of scientific theories, of understanding the formal and ontological commitments of the sciences that Deleuze and Guattari adopt. There seems to be an analogy between that and the syntactic view in sort of analytic or out of analytic philosophy of science. There seems to be a kind of corresponding analogy between, or at least there's a question of a potential corresponding analogy between the minor scientific, that pole of that distinction, or the kind of problematics-centered approach, and the semantic approach that to scientific representation that contemporary scientific philosophers of science are more on board with. And actually that you see people sort of going further and thinking, oh, well, maybe actually something like category theory, which I'm only sort of very beginning to sort of approach, better articulates and provides a better descriptive machinery for understanding what scientific theories are and how scientific theories work. And obviously there's interesting connections, analogies there with work that Rocco, is it, Gangle has done on Deleuze and category theory and things like that. And you have contemporary philosophers of science who think, yes, a kind of category theoretical framework for understanding what scientific theories are, how they work, how they relate to one another looks promising. One of the implications of it is that you ought to understand sort of the modal structure of scientific theories in this sort of purely relational way. So not in terms of sort of discrete little individual possibilities. Oh, we need a way of thinking about the metaphysics of modality, about that. Boom, Deleuze and virtuality. Like, that's a really interesting, exciting connection that question sort of brings up for me. So I think, yes, you're right. If it's the case that the way that Deleuze and Guattari predominantly think about science, if it's the case that that's along or within that sort of major scientific register, and it's more sort of statement-based, and it yields this kind of more sort of traditional metaphysical view that is in tension with what Deleuze's project is more obviously about. Yeah, I agree that there would be a kind of tension or difficulty for any kind of naturalistic interpretation of Deleuze's project. But I just don't think that's the case. I think the way he understands the sort of formal and ontological requirements of scientific theories on this kind of minor scientific register is more like what contemporary philosophers of science think, in a way that I would love to spend time sort of clearing up and figuring out. Yes. I mean, I don't know if that sort of addresses or answers your question, or gets of a sense of the connections and the tensions and the relevances there.
Yeah, no, it's great. I think I need a bibliography from you of things I need to read. And
sorry, yeah, and that's in a way that's part of what I want the paper to be, in a way, right? Like a sort of reference piece. So I hope the bibliography, the reference list of the paper, like, contains a lot of this sort of relevant stuff, and sort of sows the seeds for future work in these sorts of directions, right? When a sort of contemporary philosopher of physics working in Cambridge, Neil Dewar, mentions Deleuze in a footnote, and suspecting that Deleuze might afford the conceptual resources for, thinking of a purely sort of relational metaphysics of modality that sort of helps make sense of issues in contemporary philosophy of science and philosophy of physics. That's the kind of, thing I want this paper and project to speak to and lead on to. And there's other instances like that as well. And yeah, like, actually on my list, Dan, was a sort of paper on Deleuze and the representation of scientific theories, or Deleuze, the syntactic approach, the semantic approach, the problematic approach, or something like that, and trying to figure out how those ideas relate to one another in a way that draws on the paper you've written sort of on this subject. So again, I'm really happy you asked that question, and if anything, just gave me an opportunity to sort of vent all these ideas and relevances.
Well, if I just might add one point, because at several points you talked about, I think Ladyman talking about, we need a unified picture of the world, and that's what we expect science to give us. But I think already Kant said, that's a demand of reason, he says, but that's nothing science gives us as yet. We want it. I think when Deleuze has this notion of a chaosmos as sort of the parallel to that, and you mentioned Dupré, Cartwright, who I think indeed say, that's not something given in science. So, that too, that's a metaphysical presupposition of a unified picture of the world, or that the world is unified, and science is going to get us there. But it's not given by science per se. So it seems like lots of directions to go there with what you're talking about. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think there's a super interesting, important question there as to, I mean, what unified or unified view or unified world like means. And surely a philosophy of difference is, or a purely differential world is sort of unified, quote unquote, in some appropriately differential sense, right?
Yeah.
And is that a sense that might be shared or imported or taken from that scientific view or something like that. I don't know. Again, that's sort of another one of the branches that sort of creeps out from the paper. So yeah.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. That was really good.